There are moments in history when the noise of war falls away, not because the fighting has stopped, but because the truth has finally broken through. In the spring of 1945, deep beneath Berlin, accounts from officers present in the bunker later described tense briefings as situation reports streamed in from the Western Front. While precise details vary, several recalled a heavy silence as the scale of the collapse became clearer. The reports were devastating in their simplicity. General George S. Patton's Third Army had torn through German defensive formations with a speed that defied conventional response. Tens of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers were laying down their arms. Entire formations had collapsed so quickly that staff officers struggled to even chart what had happened. What followed inside the bunker, according to those who witnessed it, was more than anger. It was recognition, the dawning realization that something irreversible was unfolding in the West. This is the story of when the Third Reich understood it was no longer fighting a conventional campaign. It was facing a commander who had turned warfare into velocity, and velocity into collapse. A war of speed. By early 1945, Germany was bleeding from both directions. In the East, the Soviet Red Army pressed forward with relentless weight and numbers. But in the West, the war had taken on a different character entirely. George S. Patton Jr. had transformed the battlefield into something fluid, unpredictable, and merciless. German commanders were accustomed to caution. They understood Eisenhower's broad coordination and Montgomery's deliberate, grinding advances. Those were campaigns you could calculate, even if you feared them. Patton was something else. His Third Army did not creep forward. It surged. It moved like a flash flood across the German countryside, overrunning towns, cutting highways, swallowing defensive belts before they could harden. Between January and March 1945, Patton's forces were capturing prisoners at numbers that defied comprehension. Thousands were processed daily. Some days, entire formations surrendered almost intact. For Wehrmacht commanders in the West, the situation was no longer difficult. It was catastrophic. Lines that vanished. Defensive sectors once considered solid began to disintegrate within hours. Patton relied heavily on what he called reconnaissance in force. Armored spearheads would probe aggressively, searching for weaknesses. The moment a gap appeared, tanks punched through at full throttle before German units could reposition. His tank crews operated under blunt orders. Keep moving. Do not pause. Do not wait for slower elements to catch up. Momentum was protection. Hesitation was defeat. And when a breakthrough occurred, Patton did not simply push ahead in a straight line. His forces wheeled behind German positions, sealing roads and severing communications. Supply routes were sliced apart. Divisions that had been intact at dawn found themselves surrounded by dusk. German commanders attempting to coordinate countermeasures found their lines of communication cut, their reserves isolated, their maps already obsolete. Panic in the West. The psychological damage proved as destructive as the physical breakthroughs. German officers began filing reports describing what they characterized internally as a kind of paralysis. Units that might have held firm against other Allied advances abandoning positions at the mere rumor that the Third Army was approaching. Speed created shock. Shock created retreat. Retreat fed collapse. Entire sectors unraveled, not because every position was stormed, but because soldiers believed resistance was futile before the first American tank even appeared on the horizon. The Western Front, once a defensive structure stretching across maps in Berlin, was dissolving into scattered pockets of resistance. By the time reports reached the Führer bunker, they sounded almost unreal. Army groups were effectively missing. Divisions marked carefully on situation maps no longer existed as organized fighting forces. American prisoner camps were swelling so rapidly that processing centers struggled to keep pace. Reality breaks in. Hitler had long maintained a complicated relationship with reality. He believed in miracle weapons still under development. He believed the Allies would fracture politically. He believed German arms possessed an inherent superiority that would reassert itself. But Patton's advance challenged every one of those convictions at once. When senior officers attempted to brief him on conditions in the West, they chose their words carefully. How do you explain that entire formations have evaporated? That surrender is occurring in such numbers that the enemy can barely manage the paperwork? That the Western Front, as a functioning defensive line, is effectively gone? The peak of mass surrenders did not arrive with theatrical drama. There was no single explosion, no dramatic map gesture. Instead, it was a grim accumulation of evidence. By early spring 1945, historical records indicate Patton's Third Army had taken well over 100,000 German prisoners in less than 2 months. Some days alone saw tens of thousands lay down their arms. Hitler's reaction followed a pattern familiar to those around him, a pattern documented by aides and generals in their post-war accounts. First, denial. The reports must be exaggerated. Then fury. Generals accused of incompetence, cowardice, betrayal. He demanded counterattacks from units already destroyed, reinforcements from armies that no longer existed. But beneath the rage, witnesses later recalled sensing something else: fear. Hitler understood arithmetic. He knew that at the rate Patton was dismantling German forces in the West, nothing substantial would remain between the Third Army and the industrial heartland of Germany. And unlike the Soviets, whom he still convinced himself might be divided or delayed, he knew the Americans demanded unconditional surrender. Relentless doctrine. George S. Patton had no patience for fair fights. Fair fights wasted time, and time, in his mind, was the one commodity a commander could never afford to squander. He believed in applying crushing violence at breathtaking speed, striking so hard and so fast that the enemy's will collapsed before his body did. Patton had devoured military history for decades, from the legions of Rome to Napoleon's grand maneuvers, and from those campaigns he drew one unshakable lesson. Victory was not about killing every opposing soldier. It was about dismantling the enemy's ability to function, break their coordination, sever their communications, destroy their cohesion. An army that cannot think or move as one ceases to be an army. It becomes frightened men scattered across a battlefield, waiting for the inevitable. The speed over safety. To many conventional commanders, Patton's methods bordered on recklessness. While others paused to consolidate gains and secure supply routes, Patton pushed forward. He accepted risks that made even his superiors uneasy. But he understood something deeper than logistics charts could show. Momentum itself was a weapon. A defender under relentless pressure loses clarity. Mistakes multiply. Units drift apart. Eventually, resistance crumbles, not from destruction alone, but from exhaustion of the will. The Germans had pioneered maneuver warfare, Bewegungskrieg, but Patton drove it to an intensity they could not match. His armored divisions could surge 50 miles in a single day, racing past fortified strongpoints, slicing telephone lines, and spreading confusion deep in the rear. By the time German commanders identified where the main thrust was falling, Patton had already shifted it. This required bold subordinates. Patton sought out aggressive leaders who thrived in chaos. He issued broad objectives rather than suffocating detail, empowering junior officers to exploit weakness instantly. No waiting for signatures, no delay for permission. The result was that the Third Army consistently operated inside the German decision cycle. By the time Wehrmacht headquarters reacted, the battlefield had already changed. Reinforcements rushed toward positions that were no longer threatened, while American columns struck somewhere else entirely. For the German soldier in a foxhole, accounts suggest it felt less like losing a battle and more like losing control of reality itself. Breaking the line. The mass surrenders of early 1945 were not sudden collapses born of cowardice. They were the final stage of a process months in the making. German units surrendering to Patton were not raw conscripts. Many were hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had endured the brutality of that campaign in ways Western soldiers never faced. These were experienced soldiers. Yet they laid down their arms in staggering numbers. Why? First, logistics. Patton's rapid thrusts shredded German supply networks. Ammunition dwindled. Fuel evaporated. Food ran scarce. Tanks without gasoline are steel monuments. Soldiers without bullets are spectators. Second, communications. With lines cut and headquarters overrun, countless German units fought in isolation. Junior officers faced impossible choices with no guidance from above. Fight to annihilation in a hopeless pocket, or surrender and preserve the lives of their men. Many chose the latter. Third, and perhaps most decisive, was inevitability. Patton's pace created a suffocating certainty that resistance changed nothing. Positions secure at dawn were encircled by dusk. Retreat routes vanished. The Third Army did not batter every strong point. It bypassed, isolated, and surrounded them. The calculation became brutally simple: surrender while it is still an option, or die for ground that no longer matters. When American armor sealed escape routes, commanders were frequently presented with stark ultimatums rather than costly direct assaults. Confronted with that reality, thousands complied. Fury in the bunker. For Adolf Hitler, these reports were more than battlefield setbacks. They represented the unraveling of the myth he had built. The Wehrmacht had been forged in ideology, trained to endure, indoctrinated to fight to the last breath. Yet now German soldiers were surrendering in numbers that rivaled some of the worst disasters in the East, and they were surrendering to Patton, the American commander Hitler had long reportedly regarded as the most dangerous of his enemies. Inside the bunker, those who were present later described familiar stages: denial, accusations, rage. Hitler blamed his generals for incompetence, his soldiers for weakness, even the German people themselves for failing him. What he would not acknowledge was simpler and more devastating. His forces had been outmaneuvered and outpaced. His own strategic rigidity had magnified the collapse. Orders to hold every inch of ground, refusal to permit tactical withdrawals, demands for counterattacks from units already shattered. These decisions created isolated pockets that Patton could encircle and destroy at will. The dictator who once mastered political maneuver now faced a commander who had mastered modern war. The final collapse. By May 1945, historical records indicate Patton's Third Army had captured more than 650,000 German soldiers, more than any other Allied formation in the Western theater. But the true measure of his achievement was not numerical. It was psychological. In the early months of 1945, something irreversible happened on the Western Front. The German army in the West ceased to believe in victory, not because courage had entirely vanished, nor because resources were completely gone, but because Patton had engineered a battlefield where continued resistance felt futile. He achieved what great commanders throughout history have sought: victory through the collapse of morale rather than endless attrition. For Hitler, trapped underground as Soviet forces closed from the east and American columns drove in from the west, the miscalculation had become undeniable. He had dismissed the Americans as soft, their leadership as cautious, their soldiers as lacking resolve. Patton proved every assumption wrong. The hundreds of thousands taken prisoner, whether in single dramatic days or through relentless accumulation, symbolized more than defeat. They marked the failure of Nazi military doctrine against an enemy who fought faster, coordinated better, and refused to yield momentum. Germany had once stunned Europe with blitzkrieg. Now it was being undone by an American general who had pushed lightning war to its absolute extreme. In the end, what the bunker reports revealed mattered far more than any single reaction they provoked. A regime confronting the consequences of its own rigidity, facing an opponent who understood the mathematics and psychology of war with ruthless clarity. The mass surrenders of early 1945 were not merely a military episode. They were the tolling bell of the Third Reich, accelerated by one commander who refused to fight any battle except the one he intended to win.